Hello. Where should we stand, by the way? Like in here? The whole thing is okay? Good morning. This is Sina from the Truebit team. We're going to talk about the ETHPrize Bounties project.
Hi, I'm Josh Stark from L4.
I'm Robbie Bent from Truebit.
I'm Ashley Tyson. I'm from Web3 Foundation. Thank you, all of you, for joining us here today. we appreciate your 9:40 a.m. attendance. The four of us spend a lot of our time speaking with members of the community, asking them about, what their experience is building on top of Ethereum, some of the challenges that they're facing day to day. We host a number of workshops, we do a number of different phone calls, and we spend a lot of our time listening and understanding the ecosystem. And while we all believe clearly that Ethereum and blockchain is the future, we clearly know that there are issues building on top of it, which leads us to our next point. How can you afford to Lambo when you can't afford the gas? We realize that there are a number of issues around gas prices and languages and generally getting people to get to mainnet. So what we decided to do was assemble a group of people, and we would like to present today ETHPrize. So ETHPrize is a community initiative. It was created based upon some feedback that we were getting out of the community and out of some interviews that the Truebit team was doing with developers who said that they needed critical infrastructure in order to build the dApps and the protocols that they were looking to create. So we put together this community initiative, and it's managed by a group of people, and it's funded by a group of people, and we're putting, I think, important funds and project management into the ecosystem.
So what is ETHPrize in practical terms? ETHPrize has basically two components. First, we need to actually find out what the challenges are, what the problems are that developers are facing. So the first part is a very large community-driven research effort to interview more than 100 dApp developers to actually find out what are the critical problems that they face every day? What are the tools that they're missing? What are their pain points? What are their frustrations? So that's part one, is actually finding out what the problems are. Part two is addressing those problems by funding significant bounties that will be actively managed to actually produce results very quickly. Our goal, if anything else, is to actually get this stuff built and actually follow through so these projects actually exist, that they're in developers' hands as soon as possible, because the ecosystem can't wait for things that are being worked on only part-time. Thanks. I'll probably screw up the clicker. So what do we mean by big, actively managed bounties? The first component of this is that these bounties are large. And the reason for this is, frankly, I think we all feel it, that the community can be sometimes too stingy. There are so many opportunities out there for talented developers that have experience in this space, and we need to pull them away from projects that are short-term profit-driven to focus on things that have long-term extraordinary value for the whole ecosystem. There are basic tools that every developer in this ecosystem needs every single day that don't exist yet, even though there's so much capital already in this ecosystem. So the question we have to ask is not, what's an amount of a bounty that will allow some devs to recover their costs, but what is the opportunity cost of those developers working on open source tooling for developers? What is the actual value that this thing brings to the ecosystem as a whole? So we think these bounties should be large to attract great teams and to financially motivate them to actually get them done. The second part of this is these bounties will be what we call actively managed. When we started talking about this idea, we asked a lot of people with a lot of experience with software bounties what works and what doesn't. What are the problems with a bounty-driven model? And a consistent piece of feedback we received was that just putting some money available on a website and announcing it at a conference like we're doing now isn't always sufficient. Not enough developers know about it. Not enough developers might have a point of contact with the project to actually find out what's required. The spec might not have enough detail, and they might not be driven to actually complete the bounty in a timely fashion. So every bounty that's part of ETHPrize will have an advisor with some sort of stake or expertise in the project, maybe multiple advisors who can help the teams, direct them, respond to feedback. They're going to have a recruiter whose sole job it is to go and find people who have the skills to work on this bounty and actually kind of like recruit them to say, hey, here's a great bounty, it matches your skill sets, do you want to work on this? And every bounty will also have a project manager that can work with the developers, help them, get them past any blockers, get them past their own pain points, and make sure these projects actually get built. Because at the end of the day, it's mainly about making sure these tools actually exist for the ecosystem. I'm going to pass over to Robbie.
So let's talk a bit about what we've done to date. We started off conducting so far 50 one-hour interviews with developers across the ecosystem. The process was super transparent. We logged all the notes, and we're going to make a report available for anyone who wants to understand what the current problems are developing on Ethereum. Big thanks to Andy, Sina, the guys from Hexel, and Paul and Mayer for helping with the interviews. It was a massive task, spending 50 hours of time documenting this. And the interviews had a specific art to them. So, you know, it started out with some of the questions above, trying to find out what developers' pain points are, what they're really frustrated on working on now. And, you know, it started out with like transcripts, and, you know, there was an art to really digging deep to find out what people were frustrated with. And we'd sort of ask the same question over and over. You can see some of the questions above, you know, what is frustrating about building on ETH? A walkthrough of the tools and libraries you use, what is impossible with the current tools, like anything to really get at the real pain points, and like the results were really amazing. So, you know, this was a massive open source, full ecosystem involvement. As you can see, you know, a majority of the ecosystem is here. So teams from QuantStamp and Golem and Zeppelin and Polkadot and LivePeer and One Protocol and Remix and Aragon. And what was really interesting was the amount of different people we spoke with. So we spoke with security audit experts, dApp developers, people building layer 1 infrastructure, people building tooling at the actual Ethereum Foundation. So it really gave us a wide view of what different people were struggling with. So what did we learn? Like the biggest, most encouraging thing is that everybody is super enthusiastic about Ethereum. So even those that had problems with their day-to-day development were willing to get on a one-hour call and talk about how they could help. And the other thing we learned is that the ecosystem needs guidance. So while people want to help, a lot of people are unsure of like what is the best way, what is the highest leverage impact. And so as Josh said, the goal of this is to really show developers that, hey, instead of doing an ICO, you can make a lot of money by building key infrastructure that everybody needs. So here are some tidbits. I'm not going to go over all these, but they're just, you know, some super interesting things that that were kind of surfaced. So like one, you know, test nets are effed. To actually deploy to Robson, sometimes you literally need to 51% attack the network. People were complaining about getting testnet ETH. You know, everybody needs a debugger. This was mentioned by like 90% of the people. When we started this was like a huge issue, and over time, Truffle actually delivered a working debugger, which was super awesome because like doing this really led to the need to launch a debugger. It surfaced that, which was cool. You know, the ecosystem is bursty, so you see things like the Web3 library where development starts and then languishes. And this is like what we're trying to help with here is teams are siloed and they're working on tooling. But then once that tooling is available, maintaining it is often expensive and a lot of work, and that's where balls are getting dropped. So that's something that, you know, we're really going to try to help with. Gas and everything around it, as Ashley said, gas costs are high. People often don't really understand gas super well. So how does Geth estimate gas? How much does a particular operation cost? What is gas limits issued locally in Truffle? A lot was around documentation. So, you know, development environment setup is hard. The IDE environment is tough. We thought that it'd be interesting to have an ETH topology map for beginners to kind of detail all the different tools and how they fit together. Another thing that we found is interesting was building a client. So every team is working on this, and none of the info is really shared. So if you want to find out when you start to build your client what are the best practices, there's no real way to do that without talking to individuals. Something else that came up, in December that was really cool was these POA chains. So a lot of dApps were having issues with scaling, and there was discussion, like literally December, January, around how great it would be if it was easy to build sidechains. And we just came from a presentation in Barcelona called Scaling Now, and this is effectively ready. So, in the midst of when we started this interview process, you're starting to see some of these things getting built, which is just a really good sign for the ecosystem that stuff gets done quickly when there's a focus on it. The other thing that people talked about was like for the end user and not the developer, so like key management, the need to understand the difference between a private and public key, new user education, and also like anti-phishing. So I was really surprised to see how many people are super passionate about protecting noobs from losing their funding. So like there's guys that run a Skype anti-phishing group that like spend 24 hours a day trying to help people from losing money, which is really awesome to see. So, okay, like let's dive into like what isn't working. Some of the stuff we talked about was developer tooling. This seemed to be the major concern. It's just how do you solve the tragedy of the commons where infrastructure is needed for each team, but there's no real incentive for a single team to build it. So that's really what the goal of ETHPrize is. Some of the things we've identified so far, we'll talk about more, is the debugger, package manager, and open source block explorer. The other item that we're going to tackle later is documentation. Everyone referenced having a source of truth, one source of truth, where they can find updates. And finally is duplication. So the other thing we noticed, a lot of stuff was being worked on in silos, as we said, and many tools trying to do the same thing. So we think that like having identified these issues with a little bit of coordination, there's like an opportunity for a huge impact. So with that, we're going to talk a bit about the first two bounties, why they're useful in history.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we did, over 50 of these interviews talking to all these teams from across the space, and now we're going to kind of tell you the story of how two of these initial bounties came together. So the first one is around a package manager for smart contracts, which anyone who works with smart contracts will feel this pain. So here are like three of the interviews that kind of brought this point home. First was, talking to Jack from Augur, who was actually the first interview we did in these bounty series, and he was like, we need a package manager, we need to be able to see different versions of these contracts that exist. Alex Miller from Grid Plus wanted to share his trustless relay set of contracts so that people could build on top of it, but there was no good way to do that. And then more recently, we were talking to Piper Miriam from the Ethereum Foundation, who's been working on a package manager called EthPM that would, have a huge impact on the ecosystem. And he was really saying that the spec is ready, the design is like there, and now we just need resources to push it across the line. So what do we mean by package manager? This is similar to node modules and NPM if you're using JavaScript, gems if you're using Ruby, pip packages if you're using Python. It's basically a way to package code, publish it to a public registry, tie it to a version and be like, this is V1 of my hashing library. And then other people in the world can download that without having to copy paste the code or rebuild it themselves and just use it. So I guess I'll have to do this. Yep. So like Ashley, Robbie, and Josh were saying, we're forming this as an active bounty. So Piper, who's been really pushing this forward, is going to be the advisor. And the Truffle team is actually taking the role of developing this. And what this will involve is three three scopes of work. The first is defining a standard manifest for what these smart contracts will look like. So how, the dependencies for a particular smart contract are shown. The next piece is a standard spec for the registry, which is really a public index of packages where you can find them and their version. And because we're operating in this trustless, decentralized environment, we want this to be a spec where anyone can go and deploy their own registry. And the final piece is tooling to really help developers publish packages, download them, and integrate them into their code. So stuff in Web3.js, Web3.py. And the proposed funding for this is $250K, which might seem a lot, but if you kind of work backwards from the value that this gives to the ecosystem, it's actually pretty great. The next bounty that we're really going towards is an open source block explorer. So like Robbie was saying, side chains are one of the most practical ways to scale Ethereum right now. And there was this whole Scaling Now conference. Parity has the bridge chains. Grid Plus is working on something. POA work. But when you think about it, one of the points that came up from Griff at Giveth and Jorge at Aragon was that, you know, it's all well and good if you move your transactions to a sidechain, but if you don't have a block explorer to see what's happening, who's sending money to who, there's no visibility, it's not usable. So we need that. And then Richard from QuantStamp actually had kind of a creative idea, which is if you have an open source block explorer, you can use that while you're developing locally to get more insight into what's going on in your test network. So this one's kind of more at a planning stage, and it looks like POA Network will be the team that really takes this forward. And again, around 250K proposed funding to get the ball rolling.
And we're really proud to announce that we've gotten firm commitments for funding for these bounties from the Ethereum Community Fund, from Status, from Toshi Coinbase, and from ZeroX Project. And we're talking to a lot of other teams right now that are interested in funding this. And we're going to be raising and finalizing all the raise over the next couple weeks. And the other thing to note is that these are just the two first bounties. The goal of these two is to kind of be like the MVP, the alpha version of ETHPrize, to show that this model of big bounties and actively managed bounties can produce results. As the research is completed, as more teams are interviewed, we're going to be adding new bounties to ETHPrize, also with significant rewards attached to them, where we'll be looking for teams to work on those projects. So if you're interested in getting involved in some way, if you think you would want to work on a bounty, if you want to be interviewed, please get in touch. Just flip to the next slide. And check out our website, which will be on the internet very soon. And email us, find us on Twitter. Look for any of us individually at a conference, or email us personally or on Twitter. Please get in touch. We want to hear from you. Anything else, guys? I think that's it. Any questions from the audience while we still have some time?
It sounds like right now the process to like participate is pretty like ad hoc. Basically, we get in touch with you guys and we figure out how we can participate, and we go from there. Is there a do you guys have a plan or have a vision in how you want to like maybe apply a little structure around this process where, you know, more people can like go through this funnel and be organized?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing we've talked a lot about is using existing bounty platforms. There are a lot of these out there, like things like Giveth, things like Bounty.network, things like Gitcoin. Lots of these exist already. So we'd love to see eventually is having lots of these bounties, as there are more of them, both on our website to kind of like surface them and promote them and market them, but also existing on these open platforms where anybody can kind of like apply, get in touch with the advisors, and go from there. It's kind of like high touch right now because we just want to like get it working and get these products shipped, and then expand the model over time as we have success.
Yeah, I think also scalability of a solution like this is important, but now we're focused on speed. So it's how to actually get things fixed now. So, you know, we're not focusing on larger goals like sharding and scaling solutions, but, you know, usability and dev tools. And as you can see, since we've started discussion, you know, POA is now working on a block explorer. Sidechains are almost ready. The debugger was completed. So, you know, finding near-term solutions quickly is sort of a really important goal that we focused on.
Awesome presentation. Thanks, guys. Can you talk a little bit about how the list of bounties will be collected and curated? Like, people propose things. Like, is there some committee or some group of people or some way in which, you know, the community decides which projects are worth funding and who gets assigned to work on a particular project?
Yeah, for now, the goal was just to speak with 100 developers, and the interview process has been completely open. Anyone who has something to say can reach out. We just started with our personal networks, and in every interview we asked, who would you recommend speaking with? And based on what people said, we just took the most important things and got those funded. Going forward, there'll be the ability to apply directly. But for now, it's been like really, really clear what needs to be worked on. I think we've reached out to the Ethereum Foundation and all the other funds that have come together to fund Bounties to also support. But we're in the process of figuring out what the best way to do that would be.
I think to add to that, like Robbie said, we're going to be making all of the interviews available, so it might be worthwhile in the interim, if you're interested, to take a look at what some of the developers are citing as their challenges. One of the other goals is that we'll put together kind of an infographic or some sort of like more packaged data analysis of the insights that we got out of these interviews, and then feel free to propose things as well and be proactive for what you might see as a whole in the ecosystem, and we might be able to work with it that way while we scale for something a little bit more long term.
Yeah, I think also the major goal is to notify developers that there's actually a lot of money to be made helping the ecosystem versus running an ICO. And so collating all these interviews into a report and making it available, if you're new to the space, you can see, oh, wow, these are things that actually need to get worked on, and this is what people working on all the projects are asking for. So really hoping that setting up this report is going to have a lot of impact.
Yeah, sorry, I just want to add one more quick comment, which is I think there's massive value just in knowing who's working on what. Like as someone who's, a developer who's gotten into this ecosystem recently, if I'm thinking of working on an open source block explorer or something and knowing that there's this team or that team working on it, I mean, huge value in that for the ecosystem. Thanks.
Hey, what's like the process? So once say like this package manager for smart contracts is built, what's the process for like maintaining and continuous funding of those open source projects? I'm not too familiar with like managing open source. Well, actually not familiar at all. But but like is it easier when something is built to get people to make small contributions?
I think definitely once there's actually like a finished product out there, or like a finished enough version that is workable and is featureful, it's a lot easier to build an open source community around that project. Once there are users of this project, once many teams across the ecosystem are actually using it on a daily basis, that is your contributor base to supporting that product over time, because they have an incentive to keep working on it. Another thing, and this is very much still like we want your feedback and we want to learn as we go and improve this model. So another option would be to have some kind of continued funding model support projects if we think that's necessary. That's absolutely a thing that as a whole has capital. If we think it's going to work, that's a thing we could organize.
I'll just add to that. So the activation energy for taking a tool that you have within your team and making it an open source project that other people can use is quite high. So a lot of these teams that we talk to, have their own testing suites, deployment pipelines, various, hand-built custom tooling. But they don't have the resources to really, write out the documentation, make it modular, pull out all their own, custom code. So an effort like this for taking things to that stage will already be a big value add. And yeah, like Josh said, I think we as a whole, like in this space, are thinking a lot about how public funding and incentivization of open source on a continuous basis would work. So I think this is actually a really good project for experimenting with different models, and it's all experimental.
To Parker's point, similar names. To Parker's point about sort of bootstrapping versus maintenance, I think it is important to separate the two, and I think it's an awesome initiative. Sometimes you need these big 6 or sometimes maybe even 7-figure sums to get some of these projects going. On the topic of maintaining projects once they're done, though, like I don't know, do you guys know Open Collective? there's this really cool initiative called Open Collective, which it sort of exists in the fiat world today, but they're looking at maybe moving into the crypto Ethereum world as well. And the idea is that users of open source projects, like the React ecosystem, there's a number of projects, Webpack, et cetera, that run this way, right? Can contribute a very small amount of money, a bit like a Patreon, like $1 here, $3 there, like micropayments. And collectively, there's enough money then to pay a developer team on an ongoing basis to maintain it. So that would be really cool to kind of see that become a part of this maybe in the future.
Sweet. Thank you all.